Most of the time, African leaders find themselves in this spot where they're being asked, is Africa facing west or is Africa facing east? This is a question that has been put to President William Ruto. We're not going to talk about him because he's a really interesting character. We're going to talk about an astute leader in Africa who they put that question to. And for him, it wasn't important to answer that question in a diplomatic way so that he doesn't anger anybody. His answer was centered on the people that he serves and the people that he represents. This question was put to President Paul Kagame during the Global Security Forum where he was speaking at. And I think he just said it as is. The fact that China and America and every other person are fighting. And guess who the casualty always is? Africa. Africans are the ones forced to choose either or, and the choice that you make, then they remind you that the choice that you make has consequences. And President Paul Kagame says Africa is a big continent, it has so much potential, and it's time that Africa begins living for itself and people respect the decisions that the continent makes for itself.
For us, from the tragedy and from also understanding the politics, the global politics and the relationships and so on and so forth, we have made a choice. And to begin with, we work within the setting of the African continent. So when you talk about United States, China, maybe some other powers, you can say, put them together, Europe, and so on. I think lessons learned from Rwanda, here in Rwanda ourselves, but also similar to many other lessons that should have been learned across the continent. And we are seeing also US, China competition turning into increasingly adversarial sort of relationship. We don't think it is correct for Africa or for Rwanda to just be consumed by these two powers and crushed in between. I think it is important for Africa, for Rwanda to have this kind of thinking that, no, we have something to do for ourselves. We have lives to live ourselves. We don't live for others and others don't live for us. And in fact, if you look at Africa, currently about 20% of the global population. In about 25 years, Africa will be constituting 25% of the global population. And that growth involving a middle class, probably the only middle class in the world that will be growing. I mean, how can we waste this asset? Right. And this is something terribly wrong with ourselves. And we shouldn't accept this. So Rwanda, working with other African countries on the continent, we think we can relate, be friends with others, United States, Europe, China, name it, and not be dragged into this kind of conflict that benefits those others who are conflicting among themselves and simply impoverishing more or less forever the African continent. So it's a hard task, it's a struggle, but nonetheless, it's the most noble thing we can do for ourselves.
Hello there, how are you doing? Welcome to another episode of Our Conversations. My name is Ondiro Oganga. I'm a business journalist by profession and a digital content creator. I love coming on here and having conversations with you guys about Black people, Africans, our empowerment, and how we can rise up and take our rightful place at the global stage. You can connect with me in social media at Ondiro Oganga. Come over to my YouTube channel, New Dawn Africa channel, where I profile Africa through people, politics, and culture. Today, I want to talk about the fact that Africa continuously finds itself in the middle of geopolitical tension, particularly between the West and the East. And the problem with this is that Africans are forced to choose, to pick a side in tension and wars and thieves that it knows nothing about, it has nothing to do with. And guess who the biggest loser always ends up being? The African continent. Let's put this into context. I mean, China is one of the first growing and one of the strongest economies in the world. And despite the fact that their growth has been shrinking due to internal issues, we cannot downplay the significance of China in the global economy. Particularly when COVID-19 happened, they became the global manufacturing powerhouse because they were able to manage and mitigate the effects of the pandemic way earlier than every other person. So when everybody was going through lockdown and when everybody was trying to figure out what the COVID-19 pandemic is, what it really is about and how to go about it, China was miles ahead and they were way on their way to reopening the economy. And I think that gave them such a huge competitive edge. Big economy, many people, so that means that labor is really cheap. They've really invested in their education, so they have the skilled labor infrastructure. You look at America, America is also one of the global powerhouses. There's no deceiving ourselves about that. One of the strongest currencies in the world, one of the biggest economies, land of opportunities. And this is just a place where there's so much invested capital. So you can imagine that this is an economy that is buffered from all angles. Of course, there are nuances to this economy, but if you compare them to other countries, these are the two big boys that are fighting for global dominance and influence. And there's nothing wrong about that. I mean, there can only be one king of the jungle, right? Where it gets really complicated is the fact that then lines are drawn and every other person is sucked into this battle. Now, I want to put China into context for you on the African continent. China is this country that looked at the African continent and asked itself, what are the opportunities here that we can explore/exploit, depending on how you look at it, to gain influence and dominance on the African continent? And they've invested billions and billions of dollars, particularly in infrastructure over the last 20 years. Belt and Road Initiative is one of those examples, which was their flagship project, right? And then they've gone ahead to invest in other infrastructure projects, for example, roads, for example, airports, for example, rail in Kenya. And these are great projects because they're tangible projects. And so when somebody's speaking about the relationship between Africa and China, you can talk about the road that they built. On the other hand, America is always focused on a little bit more diplomatic relations and mostly trade. But you see, the trade imbalance between Africa and the US is so big. They can import from you, but the deficit is too big for you to almost feel like it's tangible impact. Of course, it's tangible impact. But if you look at the strategy that China used, you can see it and you can feel it. And also, America has not been as bullish as China in investing on the African continent. China has pumped in here so much money, nearly 10 times what America puts on the African continent. It was most recently when there was that Africa-US summit in Washington, D.C., that President Biden pledged about $55 billion for the whole African continent over a period of 3 years. This is just a drop in the ocean. This is what China can do in 2 years, right? And this is what I think Saudi Arabia did in just a year, about $45 billion. So in terms of competing from an investment spectrum, they've lagged behind. But everybody knows that America is the big brother. And if you go against them, there's always repercussions because America has its allies. And then America, together with its allies, alienate countries that are not aligned to America. So if you choose China, or if you choose to do business with China, you're literally sending a message to America that you do not necessarily want to do business with them, and you have already picked a side. And this becomes very problematic because you then get to suffer. Of course, you're getting the infrastructure money from China, but then trade is suffering because you cannot do trade with the US. And also tourism, things like tourism is suffering. Different industries are suffering because importation then becomes difficult. And that is where President Paul Kagame comes in and says, enough is enough. Stop pulling us into your battle of supremacy. Africa is an independent region, an independent continent that deserves autonomy. We can choose who to do business with, and we can be respectful. We can be respectful of the fact that this is how China does business. This is how US does business. This is where the business line is, and we're not going to cross it. But do not try to use us to try and buffer your position in that battle of supremacy, because we're the only ones that suffer. Of course, trade with the US is great, but without China's infrastructural investment money, you're missing out. You're actually missing out. Of course, China's infrastructure money is great, but if you're not doing trade with the US and their tourists are not coming in, you're also missing out. Again, the US is very important for investor sentiment, right? China is just one place, but America has way more allies. So investor sentiment is really important. The World Bank, the IMF, all these are institutions that are aligned to the West. And so if you're not in great terms with them, then that just puts you at a very complicated position. And it's really, President William Ruto, when he was answering this question, was very diplomatic. We're not facing east, we're not facing west, we're facing forward. What does that even mean? What does that even mean? I think it's really great to see that some African leaders have a backbone. They have a spine. They're standing on business and saying, we respect the fact that you big boys are fighting, but it has nothing to do with me. Leave me out of it. Let me look for my daily bread. Let me feed my people. Let me develop my region. It will take hundreds of years before we are worthy competition to you. So don't treat us like we're part of the competition. Tell me what you think about this in the comment section. Do you think that President Paul Kagame was right in just saying it as it is, or do you think that it's better to go with a diplomatic approach like President William Ruto, just for the sake of peace and diplomacy, so that the lines just remain blurry and people keep moving in the direction that they are? Thank you so much for watching. My name is Ondiro Oganga. I'll see you again next time.